Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, students. Students, today we are going to start our next lecture in the continuation of our series of lectures on the novel Pride and Prejudice. Yesterday, we discussed in the previous lecture, we discussed chapter 6, 7, and 8. Today, we are going to discuss some more chapters of the novel in today's lecture. So let's start from chapter 9. Uh, in chapter 9, we see that Elizabeth sends home a note requesting that her mother come and visit Jean. Mrs. Bennet arrives with Lydia and, not wishing Jane to leave Bingley's company, declares that Jane seems worse than ever. That, as we have already noticed and discussed in the previous lecture, that Mrs. Bennet does not want her daughter to come home soon. Therefore, she is pretending or creating some kinds or tries to create some kind of hurdles so that her daughter may not come home as soon as Elizabeth or Jane want. Mrs. Bennet continues her ridiculous and manipulative campaign to win Bingley for Jane. This was her scheme, her very meek or to an extent uh, shrewd scheme through which she wants to keep her daughters at Bingley so that she may win Bingley in this way. But but at the same time, she is not able to realize that this would further harm her daughter's future if she carry continues to do so. Next, we see in the same chapter that in conversation, Mrs. Bennet, seeking to raise Jean's status, tries to impress Bingley about her family and their situation in the country. Darcy suggests that one finds more variety of character in town than in country, but Mrs. Bennet loudly objects. Again, bad manners. In order to impress Darcy and Bingley, she is showing so much things which she does not do actually. And in objecting and in replying, she is actually exposing her shallow and fickle mentality, and which is disgusting to these people. वो उल्टा उनको अपने खिलाफ सा कर रही है. Everyone is surprised. Elizabeth is mortified and tries her best to fill the awkward silence. When she loudly refuses or refutes Mr. Darcy, it makes everybody embarrassed and surprised. और ये जो बात है ये ज्यादातर एलिजबेथ को खराब कर रही है कि एलिजबेथ बेचारी की इन सब के सामने इंसल्ट हो रही है और उसकी माँ को बिल्कुल भी एहसास नहीं है कि वो अपनी इन हरकतों से क्या कर रही है. और by talking up the Bennet's status, Mrs. Bennet actually degrades it by seeming cross, foolishly proud, and clearly not of the best class or character. If you are high class, you don't need to tell others about it. They just know it. But she is telling herself that we belong to a high class. It goes without saying if you belong to some high class. Lydia jumps in to remind Bingley of his promise to give a ball at Netherfield. Bingley says he hasn't forgotten but will wait until Jane recovers. Lydia's insistence is impolite. She is rudely, or rather childishly, insisting in a very impolite way. Bingley, with his better breeding, turns it into a compliment to Jane. तो वो उसने थोड़ा सा बात को थोड़ा सा डील कर लिया, जैसे समझ ले हैंडल कर लिया. लेकिन ये लोग जो हैं, लीडिया, मिसेस बेनेट लोग, दे आर uh, leaving no stone unturned, if I may use this idiom, to embarrass Mr. Elizabeth in the eyes of Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Hurst and her sister Caroline Bingley. The next day, Elizabeth joins the evening party in the drawing room. Caroline looks on as Darcy tries to write a letter. Trying to flatter him, she offers empty compliments about his writing, but only manages to interrupt him. This is another very important scene at Bingley's house where we see Darcy busy in writing a letter, whereas at the same time Caroline Bingley uh, is interrupting her. Whenever a character in Pride and Prejudice tries to scheme their way to social advantage, they invariably end up with the opposite result. Whatsoever one does in this novel, you will also notice throughout the happenings and events of the novel that whatever one tries to do, it ends up or it results into something very opposite that one intends to do. जो कुछ करना चाहता है, जो कुछ स्कीम लगाता है, उसकी उल्टी निकलता है इसमें। तो ऐसा ही आप इसमें नॉवल में देखेंगे। तो ऐसा ही होता है जिसमें वो डार्सी को अपनी तरफ इम्प्रेस करने की कोशिश कर रही है, लेकिन डार्सी उल्टा उसके उससे दूर हो रहा है। Elizabeth and Darcy get into an argument about Bingley's character. Darcy says that people should always follow their convictions. Elizabeth counters that sometimes regard for others must modify one's conduct. But Bingley, hating conflict, stops them. Here we find a skirmish of wits between the two, Darcy and Elizabeth. Darcy reiterates his pride in his own beliefs. Elizabeth pridefully believes that she considers other people's views, but events will show that she really just follows her own prejudices. These both main characters are prejudiced and blind to each other's follies, even to their own selves. They are not yet realized their own perceptions, own real selves. It is very easy to judge others. It is very easy to know other, but it is very hard and sometimes impossible to know one's own real self. Who am I is the most difficult question to answer. But who is he or who is she is the very simple or the easiest question to ask or to answer. इसका जवाब तो बड़े आसान से दे सकते हैं। हम मैं कौन हूँ ये बड़ा मुश्किल है। These people are saying, both Elizabeth and Darcy, that they know what they are saying, but they don't know that their judgments are not clear about others, leaving others apart. They are not even very much in acquaintance with their own selves, own true selves. They are just following their prejudices. As Bingley's sisters sing at the piano, Elizabeth notices that she seems to fascinate Darcy. He asks her to dance and she playfully refuses. Still, Darcy is bewitched. He thinks that if it wasn't for her lowly connections, he might fall in love. This is a very important thing to notice that Elizabeth attracts Darcy by standing up to him. Yet, class and pride are so important for Darcy that attraction alone won't suffice. It's a very important thing that goes by the title of the novel, where we see that Darcy thinks that she is a girl worth marrying, worth falling in love with, but she is not worth marrying because of her status, because of her low status. So Darcy is a very class conscious person who gives a lot of importance to class, and he thinks that if had she not been a girl from a low class, she might have married her. तो उससे शादी कर लेता अगर वो लो फैमिली से ना होती। कैरोलीन is increasingly jealous of Darcy, of Elizabeth, as she does not want Elizabeth get raised in the eyes of Darcy. She herself is trying to attract Darcy, but he is not giving her any or giving any heed or any attention to Miss Caroline Bingley. Therefore, she is jealous of Elizabeth. She thinks that Elizabeth is the one who may uh, usurp her place. The next day, she takes Darcy on a walk to tease him about marrying Elizabeth and about the awful family he would join. Elizabeth बड़ी एक जेलस खातून है और वो अगले दिन डार्सी को जानबूझ के एक वॉक पे लेके जाती है अपने साथ और वहां पे उसको तंग करती है, इरिटेट करने की कोशिश करती है, because she also knows that Darcy is a man who uh, prefers class a lot. Therefore, she touches her from this very point. There is a play of Shakespeare where titled Othello, where an where an where a manipulative and a very cunning character, Iago, says when the other person implores us to do something, he says that don't touch me so near. Don't touch me so near mean that she is also touching Darcy so near the very place, the very impulse of Darcy that may work, that may trigger him to do something. That is the weak point of Darcy because he also believes in class hierarchy. She is touching or teasing Darcy from that place so that he may start abhorring Elizabeth and give up the idea, if he has any idea of marrying Elizabeth. There she says that what would happen, imagine if you marry a girl like Elizabeth of such a low class, you are going to join a terribly लो क्लास फैमिली। कहती सोचो कि तुम्हारी सास कौन होगी, मिसेस एलिजाबेथ जैसी, मिसेस बैनेट जैसी खातून तुम्हारी सास बनेगी। ऐसे लोगों के साथ क्या तुम मूव कर लोगे, ऐसे लो क्लास लोगों के साथ? दिस वाज द वेरी थिंग दैट वुड annoy and tease Mr. Darcy as well. और वो she tries to exploit Darcy's pride in the integrity of his family and protect her chances with him. She is actually trying her own chance on Darcy. So therefore, she is doing such things with Darcy, and obviously she is uh, jealous of Elizabeth. Now we come to the next chapter. This chapter is chapter number 12. In the 12th chapter, we see that that evening Jane is well enough to join the group where this group includes Bingley, Darcy, Caroline Bingley, Elizabeth, and Mrs. Hurst, the other Bingley sister. Bingley dotes on her and talks to no one else. Dotes on her, he just loves her. Loves Jane, and he only talks to her. Meanwhile, she was there for dinner, and he talks no one else except Jane. Caroline watching Darcy uh, read, pretends to be absorbed in reading a book, but she is soon bored and suggests to Elizabeth that they walk around the room together. This gets Darcy's attention. Now onwards, we will find each and every act of Caroline Bingley based on jealousy and based on one motive, only motive, or solely motive, and that motive is to attract Darcy's attention and dislocate or displace Elizabeth as far from Darcy's eyes as possible. Conversations, books, walks. These are the few tools of seduction in the Regency era or in Austen's world, particularly. Books, वॉक्स एंड कन्वर्सेशंस, ये तीन तरीके थे जिसमें से सड्यूस करने के तरीके थे उस जमाने के अंदर एक दूसरे खवातीनों हजरात इस्तेमाल करते थे. कन्वर्सेशंस, फक्त इस शौक में पूछी हैं हजारों बातें, मैं तेरा हुस्न तेरे हुस्ने बयां तक देखूं. किताबों से के जरिए भी मोहब्बत डिस्कस करने से बढ़ती थी, पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू. फिर वॉक्स, वॉक्स में भी इन सब चीजों में एक बात मुश्तरक है, वो है गुफ्तगू. तो वो गुफ्तगू जो है वो इंसान को जानने का, उसके साथ रगबत बढ़ाने का एक तरीका था. कैरोलिन हैज टू वर्क टू गेट डार्सी's attention. Caroline's life's sole motive or sole goal is to get Darcy's attention. But by doing what comes natural to her, Elizabeth gets it anyway. So she, whatever she is doing is not coming to her, but it is coming to Elizabeth without doing anything. So it was quite natural. Caroline invites Darcy to join them, but he says, as we know that he was writing a letter and these two girls were roaming around the room, but he says that he hasn't want to interfere. They must either be sharing secrets or showing off, in which case he is happy to watch. In this event, we see that, or we may assume that, sexual attraction in the novel are expressed only in little comments like these, but it is definitely there. It is something that today's reader will have to assume or will have to dig down into the sentence or into the talk of the characters to know the real meaning or know the real attentions of the characters of the time. But it was quite easy a way or easy a thing to know what are these characters are saying, because it was quite common and kind of rampant thing in that time. Next we see Elizabeth advises Caroline that the best response is to laugh at what is ridiculous. This is a very important and significant or specific trait of Elizabeth's character. This is also what Jane Austen thinks about life. This is actually Jane Austen's own point of view, and she is extending her point of view through her mouthpiece Elizabeth, where she says that we sometimes assume so much seriousness, do not laugh at things which are laughable, we just pretend to be serious or pretend to be mum and numb to such events. But she is of the view that the best response is to laugh at what is ridiculous. We should laugh at ridiculous things. We should not assume or bury it under the layer of mannerism or so-called formalities. And this thing leads to a discussion of the aspects of Caroline Bingley tries to bring out something that may harm Elizabeth's position in Darcy's eyes, but it fires back. Darcy claims that his main fault is that my good opinion, once lost, is lost forever. You should underline or note down this very line about Darcy's perception or Darcy's character, that he thinks that my good opinion, once lost, is lost forever. एक दफा मैंने किसी के बारे में मेरा इमेज, मैंने मेरे जहन से उसका इमेज खराब हो गया, तो हमेशा के लिए हो गया। यानी यहाँ पे वो बताना चाहता है, शो करता है कि उसका प्राइड आता है। दूसरी बात इसमें यह भी है कि उसके अंदर अपने आप को मॉडिफाई करने की या बेहतरी की, डीकंस्ट्रक्शन के बाद कंस्ट्रक्शन वाली जो कैपेसिटी है वो कम है। एंड दिस इज अ वेरी bad thing in one's personality where one cannot modify or have the ability to move on. When Elizabeth retorts that it is difficult to laugh at a propensity to hate everybody, this is a kind of satire on the part of Elizabeth, where she actually insinuating her belief, where she has harbored some kind of uh, prejudice, her prejudice against Mr. Darcy, and she actually uh, retorting this thing, pointing out towards Darcy's behavior that she hasn't forgotten yet, the event that happened at the very first meeting between the two, where he said that she is merely tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me, where she thinks or where she assumed that Mr. Darcy is a person who has the propensity to hate everybody. We have noticed that in the very first meeting at Meryton, where Mr. Darcy was introduced to these countrymen or country people, and he kept himself aloof and stood aloof in that ball. He didn't dance with anyone, and he didn't talk to anyone. If he talked at all, he talked with some of his own people. He didn't said or breathed even a single word to these people. And this thing gave the impression that Mr. Darcy is a very proud, up-nosed, conceited, and uncouth person who hates everybody, who has some kind of disdain for low people. He is a very class conscious people, and this thing made an impression of Darcy of a very worst kind in the minds of the people of this area. And Elizabeth is one of them as well. Elizabeth, who loves to read other people's character, who loves to discern other people. But here, Elizabeth is not in a very good position or in a very good position to be called a true reader of the other people. She too is prejudiced against him. Therefore, she says that it is difficult to laugh at a propensity to hate everybody. हर किसी को नफरत करने वाले जो रुझान है किसी इंसान की तबीयत के अंदर, उसके ऊपर हंसना बहुत मुश्किल है. Darcy says that if his defect is holding grudges, Elizabeth is misunderstanding people. तो वो उसको आगे से जवाब देता है जैसा कि वो समझता है इस लड़की ने मुझे गलत समझ रखा है. कहता तुम्हारा डिफेक्ट ये है कि तुम जानबूझ के लोगों को गलत समझ लेती, मिसअंडरस्टैंड करती हो. तो ये दोनों कैरेक्टर्स यहाँ पे एक दूसरे के बारे में गलत परसेप्शंस रखते हैं और उसके ऊपर वो एक दूसरे को बात कर रहे हैं. वो समझ रहा है इस लड़की ने मुझको गलत समझा है, कि मेरी बात को उसने गलत अंदाज में लिया, और वो उसको अपनी तरफ से पूरी तरह से ये यकीन ईमान रखती है कि ये बंदा हर दूसरे बंदे से नफरत करता है जो किसकी क्लास का नहीं है. डार्सी incorrectly identifies his own flaw. He has identified his flaw, but his identification of his flaw is incorrect, which is the immense pride he takes in himself and his social standing, where he says that my good opinion, once lost, is lost forever. He actually is suffering from a class consciousness like disease, and he is unable to realize this thing. But he correctly diagnoses Elizabeth's pride, Elizabeth's defect. As I have just mentioned or said earlier, that it is very easy to diagnose other people's personalities but it is very hard or impossible to diagnose one's own real self. अपने आप को जानना बहुत मुश्किल है, दूसरों को जान लेना तो फिर आसान होता है. Here we see the same thing, that he incorrectly knows himself, whereas he correctly knows Elizabeth, where he sees that she believes so fully in her own ability to see to the heart of things that she becomes subject to her prejudice and blinds herself to the truth. वही जो बात कि तुम लोगों को समझते कहते हैं, तुम बड़ी बनी फिरती हो ना, या अपनी तरफ से तुम समझती हो कि मैं एक नजर में ही जमीन के 7 पर्दों के अंदर तक देख लेती हूँ. तुम्हें कहता है कुछ नजर नहीं आता. तुम दरअसल अपने प्रेजुडिस के थ्रू लोगों को देखती हो और उसको सच मान लेती हो और हकीकत से दूर चली जाती हो. तुम्हें इसका फिर असल नजर नहीं आता. दिस इज व्हाट आई हैव ऑलरेडी डिस्कस्ड समवेयर इन दिस during the lectures of Pride and Prejudice or somewhere else in the class, that until you are in hate or in love with someone, you are not in a position to make a good decision or to judge that person or that thing or situation. Because if you love someone, you will not be able to see that person's defects or flaws. But if you are in hate or if you have some kind of prejudice against that person or situation, then you will not be able to see that person's abilities and good qualities. You will remain blind to all those aspects. In both the situation, one cannot make a good decision or make a good judgment. Same is happening with Elizabeth. She is prejudiced against Darcy, therefore she is not able to see Mr. Darcy's real self. Now we come to the next chapter, that is chapter number 13. In this chapter, we see that Elizabeth and Jane try to, sorry, Elizabeth and Jane write to Mr. Bennet and sends write to Mr. Bennet. These both sisters who are rightly residing at Mr. Bingley's house at Netherfield, write by Mrs. Bennet to send their carriage to take them home. Mrs. Bennet receives the letter and, still scheming to have them stray, replies that replies to that letter that it isn't available. तो कहती हो कैरेज नहीं है घर पे. उसकी माँ अभी तक स्कीमें लगा रही है कि ये बच्चियां वहीं पे रही आई ना. ये इसकी बड़ी फजूल सी स्कीम है. हालांकि अगर इफ यू वांट टू अट्रैक्ट समवन और वांट टू get some kind of person, तो आप जितना करीब जाएंगे ये मोहब्बत की फीलिंग या जो अट्रैक्शन है उतनी कम होना शुरू हो जाएगी. दूर रहना पड़ता है. लेकिन ये उल्टे तरीके से अपनी बेटी को वहां पे रखने की कोशिश कर रही है और शी इज सो desperate. She wants to get any of her daughter married at any cost. She is not even thinking the about the her daughters and about the honor of her family. Well, she refuses to send the carriage. So Elizabeth and Jane, who are determined to leave Netherfield now, have to borrow Bingley's carriage instead. उनसे रिक्वेस्ट करती हैं कि आप अपनी कैरेज दे दें, हमने जाना है. Mrs. Bennet's schemes to get Jane married to Bingley force her daughters to be beggars. बना दिया ना उनको, वहां उनकी नजरों में गिरा दिया ना. Making the Bennet family as a whole look bad. ये सिर्फ एक बंदे की गलत हरकत जो होती है. आप अपने घर के एम्बेसडर होते हैं कहीं पर भी हो, और किसी अब इसमें एलिजाबेथ का कसूर नहीं है. उनकी माँ की इन हरकतों की वजह से वो जैसी उनकी माँ वहां पर आती है और कोई ऐसी हरकत करती है, हालांकि अपनी तरफ से वो मोहब्बत में या उनकी परेशानी में सिंपथी में कर रही है, लेकिन ये सारा कुछ उल्टा उनके गले पड़ जाता है. बहरहाल डार्सी इज रिलीव्ड He is starting to worry that his attraction to Darcy might show. So he remains distant for the short remainder of her stay. Meanwhile, Mr. Darcy, who believes or who thinks that his attraction to Darcy might show, might be remains Elizabeth for the remainder of the day. He avoids her so that her feelings may remain dormant, hide from Elizabeth from other people. Here we also see that Darcy has not overcome his prejudice against Bennet's low connections. उसको कहीं ये यहीं कहीं ना कहीं ये डर है उसके दिमाग में कि कहीं ऐसा ना हो जाए कि मेरी फीलिंग्स जो हैं वो शो अप हो जाएं और मुझे कुछ ऐसा मैं इस हद तक ना चला जाऊं कि मुझे इस लड़की से शादी करना पड़े और वो सिर्फ इस वजह से अपने आप कंस्ट्रेन कर रहा है कि वो ही डज नॉट वांट टू बी a relative of this family, this low connectioned family, low status family. वो तो जो बहुत क्लास कॉन्शियस आदमी है, he is much worried about these things. Though Mrs. Bennet is disappointed when these girls reach back home, Mrs. Bennet is disappointed that Jane and Elizabeth didn't stay. उसने तो पूरी अपनी स्कीम लड़ाई थी ना, मैं भेजूंगी नहीं, कह रही तो नहीं आएंगी, लेकिन वो आ जाती हैं. So she gets disappointed. Mr. Bennet is glad to have them back. He had missed their conversation amid Kitty and Lydia's infatuation with anything related to the regiment. वो घर में पक चुका है अपनी दोनों छोटी बेटियों किटी और लीडिया की बातें सुन सुन के, जिसमें हर बात में वो फौजी ले आती हैं. वो रेजिमेंट वहां पे ठहरी हुई, वहां पे ये हो गया, वहां पे ये कर दिया फौजी ने, वो हर वक्त घर में फौजियों की बातें होती रहती हैं. दे आर सो obsessed with regiment and militia and army officer, and he is so much frustrated and irritated by their conversation, and therefore he is very glad to have his other daughters back. At the same time, Mr. Bennet wants to ignore his younger daughter's interest in the regiment, to remain detached from anything that strikes him as ridiculous. This will come back to haunt him. This is an example of a bad parenting, where Mr. Bennet is not fulfilling his responsibility as a good father or as a good parent. The next chapter, that is chapter number 13, might be our last chapter for our today's discussion. The next morning, Mr. Bennet reveals to his family that they will have a surprise guest, Mr. Collins. This is another important character that is to be introduced today, and he reveals through and he announced through a letter that he is coming uh, to Longbourn at Mr. Bannard's home, and Mr. Ballon informs his family that Mr. Collins is coming. Mr. Collins is the person or is the relative who will inherit Mr. Bannard's estate after Mr. Bennet. The news upsets Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet, because Mr. Collins can legally kick Mrs. Bennet and her daughters out of the house when Mr. Bennet dies. This was his legal right that he can kick them out of the house. But the tone of reconciliation in Mr. Bennet's letter consoles her. लेकिन जिस अंदाज में उसने खत लिखा ना कि वो पुरानी अपने बाप की और मिस्टर बैनर के दरमियान जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट था उसको मीटअप करना चाहता हूँ, तो ये चीज ने थोड़ा सी तसल्ली दी कि शायद बचत हो जाए. कॉलिंस जो है is Mr. Bennett's heir because women, as we have already discussed in the introductory lecture, weren't allowed to inherit. This explains Mrs. Bennett's obsession about getting her daughters married. It was the only way to ensure their financial security and her own if her husband died before she died. So, therefore, he becomes a very important in the eyes, especially in the eyes of his family. The letter explains that Mr. Collins is now a parish rector and enjoys the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is another important character that will be introduced later on when Elizabeth uh, visits the Mr. Collins' home or Lady Catherine de Bourgh's estate. Lady de Bourgh, whose wealth and generosity Mr. Collins tirelessly compliments. He leaves no chance to admire her patronage. हर जगह पे इसने एक ही पहाड़ा, एक ही तराना सुनाना होता है और वो बड़े फख्र के साथ बताता है कि मैं लेडी कैथरीन की पैट्रोनेज में काम करता हूँ. He now seeks to make peace in the family by some unspecified plan. मिस्टर कॉलिंस को अचानक जो ख्याल आया है ना सुलह का, वो एवं नहीं आ गया, उसके पीछे कोई ना कोई मसला है. Mr. Colin gets ahead in the world not through his own virtues, but by sucking up to the rich and by his almost arbitrary future inheritance of the Bennet's property. जैसे मुश्ताक है, यूसुफी कहता है कि दुनिया में आगे बढ़ने के दो ही तरीके हैं, एक अपनी काबिलियत से और दूसरा दूसरों की जो होती है ना नाअहली की वजह से. तो ज्यादातर लोग दूसरों की नाअहली को ही, दूसरे तरीके को ही कहते हैं अडॉप्ट करते हैं. तो ये जो बंदा है मिस्टर कॉलिंस, ही इज डूइंग द सेम जॉब. वो खुद अपने वर्च्यूज की वजह से दुनिया में आगे नहीं बढ़ रहा, बल्कि वो दूसरों की नाअहली और दूसरों को इस तरीके से चूना लगा के आगे आ रहा है. When Mr. Colin arrives, he is heavy, pompous, and dull. This is Mr. Collin's description, where we find him in this way. His conversation is weighted with overwrought compliments and vague hints about making amends to Bennet daughters. Austen makes Mr. Collins a ridiculous comic figure in the process, mocking all sucks up. तो मिस्टर कॉलिंस लिटरेचर के अंदर एक ऐसे ही करेक्टर के परमानेंट अम्यूजमेंट का एक सोर्स है थ्रू आउट द होल ऑफ द लिटरेचर, इंग्लिश लिटरेचर. हम इसको इंग्लिश लिटरेचर में एक बड़े अच्छे तौर पे मिस्टर कॉलिंस को एक स्पेसिफिक करेक्टर के तौर पर जानते हैं. ये बेसिकली एक मौलवी है, ऐसा फजूल सा आदमी है कि आप इसको लिटरेचर में जानते हैं. मिस्टर कॉलिंस जो है वो यहाँ पर शादी की नीयत से आया है, क्योंकि उसका कहना है कि मुझे मेरी पैट्रोनिस जो है, क्योंकि वो हर काम सोता जागता उठता बैठता खाता पीता, हर काम सांस भी अपनी मालकन के हुक्म से लेता है. तो कहता है उसने हुक्म दिया कि बेटा अब तुम शादी कर लो. To with that express purpose of marrying one of Bennet's daughters. तो अब ये इन Bennet's की daughters से शादी के चक्कर में यहाँ पर आया हुआ है इस यात्रा पे. तो इससे onwards students we will start tomorrow our next lecture regarding this novel. If you have any query or any question about today's lecture, you may ask me openly in the comments or um, in the your WhatsApp group. Thank you very much.